Hello and welcome to the fifth of Panel Mini Festival of Game Writing, World Building, the art and craft of creating new worlds in video games. I can't believe it's the fifth one already. This week has been wonderful and successful, and it seems to have flown by. I hope you've joined us for some of the others. If you're watching on recordings, please do go back and join us for some of the others. Before we start, here's a little information about the Writers Guild. We'd like to thank Fusebox for sponsoring these events. I'd like to thank the Writers Guild of Great Britain for hosting them. The Writers Guild of Great Britain is a TUC affiliated union operating in the UK, where we represent writers from across all different media, be you in film, theatre, television, books, children's, comedy, radio or beyond. We also represent games writers. We've had a committee representing game writers for over a decade now. We're the first writers union in the world as a former video games committee. That committee has been responsible for things such as the video games guidelines, which you can find through the link which is on your screens right now. We're currently reviewing these, so if you'd like to be part of that and to help shape the industry, you can do that by activating the survey which is there. That'll be open to the 31st of July 2020. If you've missed that, please do look at the guidelines, and hopefully you'll be even able to see the revised ones later this year. We also arrange events, support, contract vetting, networking, and with this being the fifth of the events, I'll say that we are already planning some more events. So do keep track of the Writers Guild on Twitter and other places to find out about our future events. Just ahead of today, just to warn you that one of our panelists is having some technical difficulties. Due to internet bandwidth issues, I'm afraid Toya is coming across quite quietly. The content she is about to give us will be amazing, and so but please do have your volume control there handy, just to make sure that you can hear us through there. We do apologise for that technical issue. How we've managed to get speakers from around the world across a week with as few problems as we've had, touch wood, I don't know, but we do have that one problem this evening, so please do have your volume control handy. Right, that's enough for me, and I will hand across to the panel and the panelists. Thank you very much for joining us.
To the final panel of the week on world building. So I'm your chair for the evening, so my job is to make sure that we keep things going and that we're asking all the important questions about world building. So my name's Samantha Webb. I'm a narrative designer and a producer. I've worked on AAA and indie games before, so most recently I've worked on Assassin's Creed Valhalla as a scriptwriter. I've also worked on Broken Roads, which is a post-apocalyptic RPG, and Yokai Moon, which is a tower defense game built by a studio of 3 women, which has been really good fun. So I'm going to introduce you to each of my panelists. I'm going to get them all to introduce themselves rather than me mess it up for them. So I'm going to go through the order I've got them. So Beth, you're up first.
Ani, my name is Beth Laponce. I am an Anishinaabe, Métis, and Irish American game writer, designer, and artist.
Thank you. Anne, you're up next for me.
I am Annie Reed. I'm the narrative director on the Avatar project at Ubisoft Massive in Malmö, Sweden. I've been in games for about 12 years as a writer and a narrative director. And before that, I was in film as a story consultant and a teacher for a long time, and a writer.
Thank you very much. Toya.
I am Toya Kristen Finley. I am a writer and editor in general. I have also been in the industry now about 12 years, like Annie. I've done game design, narrative design, writing, and editing. Mostly right now I'm doing a lot of editing, and also I'm the senior editor of a new interactive fiction app called Sonnet Interactive.
Very cool, thank you. And Anthony.
Yeah, hi, I'm Anthony Johnston. In games, I'm best known as the writer of Dead Space. I also wrote Zombie U and worked on Shadow of Mordor and a bunch of other stuff. And then outside of games, the movie Atomic Blonde was based on one of my graphic novels, and I've also spent years working in comic books and film and all manner of stuff, and I write thriller novels, all good stuff, but it all mostly involves building worlds.
which leads us nicely into our topics for the evening. So obviously we've got a really great, group of panelists here with a lot of experience. So I'm really excited about what I'm going to learn tonight and the kind of things you're going to be sharing with us. So to kick us off with the Q&As, I suppose the first one to ask is, how do you get started with world building? Like when it comes to those foundations, do you have tips and ideas that you can share with people who are looking to maybe, you know, build their first worlds? How do they get started? How do they put that pen to the page, and what to do first? You know, if you're happy to answer, then just give me a wave, and I can kind of call on people like I'm in a classroom. That might save us all talking over each other. So Anthony, go for it.
I think there's the foundational thing with world building is to ask, what is different or unique about your world? Like not just compared to our real world, but also to other examples of the kind of world you're building in similar genres and other works. You know, what is it that separates your fantasy from every other fantasy out there? What is it that makes your detective story different to all the other detective stories? And then from there, it's extrapolation. How did that difference come about? Why is that difference there in your world? How did it affect the world's development? And then how will it affect your narrative? But I think you have to start, or I certainly feel that I have to start with, yeah, what is different or unique, and then build everything out from there as a sort of process of extrapolation.
So you kind of look at the differences rather than the similarities when you start off.
Yeah, because, you know, the similarities, anybody can look at those and see those and write those, and they're not what will attract somebody to the world that you're building. You know, why do we play the games set in alternate worlds? Not because we want to encounter something that we already know in our real world. It's because we want to see the unique elements in that particular world.
Thank you. Any other thoughts on that, on how to get started, how to start building your first world?
First of all, can everybody hear me okay? I'll lean in if you can.
You are quite quiet, Toya.
Okay. I'll try to speak really loudly. So when I was thinking about that question, what I realized was that everything that I came up with were things that really gets my imagination going. And I think that's very important because you start connecting dots. So like, you know, the questions of journalism, the W's of journalism, who, what, where, when, why, and how, that gets you thinking. I love using analogs, whether they're fictional analogs or real analogs, you know, like public figures, eras in history, and just doing research. Doing research gets me thinking. It doesn't mean that you're going to copy and paste something from history, but it just gets you to see what has happened in the past, how you can use something that's similar in your world, and it also gives you some credibility because it has happened before. It's believable. And also, I think it's really important to not feel like you have to have all of the answers as you're starting. Ask yourself questions. If you don't know the answer yet, you know, leave yourself questions in documents so you can come back to it later. So how does your brain work? How does your imagination work? What can you do to get your imagination boosted?
I really like that, yeah. Annie, yes.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think you, in fact, shouldn't know all of the answers to all of your questions when you begin because crafting and thinking about it is a way of answering the questions. But you should, I think, some things you should be thinking about right from the start are, to go back what Anthony said, like if you're going to do a noir, for example, you know, what is the unique thing that you're bringing to this world? Like, are you going to do something like, you know, gritty period piece like LA Noir? Are you going to do something like a set in the future like Blade Runner? Like figuring out what is the angle, you know, so it's not, if it's the Tolkien high fantasy world, for example, what's different about your version of it? But also to what Toya was saying, I think knowing some of the, for me, understanding what kind of player experience you want to have is a big place to begin. Like, especially what do you want your player to feel? And I think even before you have a lot of the answers, people generally have a sense of what they want the player to feel. Like, what is the tone? What kinds of thematic big questions do you want to explore? Like, do you want to explore, like, do you want to do something that's like The Last of Us, like something bleak that talks, that if you're going to do a post-apocalyptic game, for example, do you want to do something there's comedic versions of post-apocalyptic games, there's serious bleak versions, and I think there's different kinds of, moral questions, ethical questions that you can ask in those different worlds, and usually, even if you don't have all the answers, having a sense of what those big questions are that you want to ask and what you want the player to feel is a great place to start.
Great, thank you. Beth?
Yeah, so I'm very visual and auditory, although I am also a writer. And so one of my first steps usually is creating a playlist of songs that I feel will like resonate with the tone of where the start of the world is. And then, yeah, maybe I'm listening to that obsessively over and over and over again. But the idea is just to let it go to some extent, to trust in the process of gathering together materials, whether that be visuals or reading other writing samples or thinking about the games that you love to play, those emotional experiences that you've had in any form of media, and then compiling that together and giving yourself some space. So allowing yourself to take down those notes, ask those questions, as Toya mentioned, and like let it come into form gradually, I think is something that I have had to be very patient with myself to learn. When I first started, I was really in a rush, right? Like this idea that I had to get it all out right away. But when you're world building, you have to keep in mind that for it to feel really robust, there has to be a whole history that has taken place here. There's relationality between why everything is the way it is. And it may not be possible to convey all of that through the game itself, but it's something that you need to know. And so letting that come into form is going to take time.
I think that's really great advice. Yeah, thank you. I mean, I must admit as well, I'm also, although a writer, I'm very visual. So I often start off with mood boards or going on Pinterest and literally just, looking through and kind of gathering that aesthetic, I suppose, that then goes on to inspire me. I suppose the only thing that I would like to add as well is that I think when it comes to this idea of world building, it's where it's really important that we as writers and designers are also reading in lots of different fields. So we're reading about different cultures, we're reading history, we're reading psychology, because that can often be where you find those little hooks of interesting things. Like I have a notebook that whenever I read anything interesting from whatever, I will stick it in there. And then when I'm looking at building something new, I might go through and see if there's anything there that kind of matches the feel and the type of world, like you were saying about Annie, about if you're going to do a post-apocalyptic world, what kind of post-apocalyptic world that is. And I think that's where these little snippets of things you've learned before or pictures or sounds can really help to kind of inspire and kickstart that process. So that's really great. So I'm going to go for the second question, which I think is a great one. So we got this before the panel started. How do you name things? And please share your secrets. So I think this is great because obviously it's, as writers, we know it can be really difficult naming things. You can spend hours kind of agonizing over the perfect name for that village on the outskirts of the world. So I'm really interested to hear, what, do you have any secret ways you go about doing this? Is there anything that you can share with us today to inspire us all? Yeah, go for it, Beth.
I just have a joke, which is that it's just with as few characters as possible. Just keep your character count low and you're good to go.
Nice.
Well, if it's a humorous game, puns are always good. Also, think about the naming conventions of the time for things and for people. Also, I like using etymologies because I think subtext is very important. So sometimes you can use the etymology of a word that will be in a name that gives your players some clues into the attributes or characteristics of someone or something.
Like the Dickens approach. I'm terrible at naming things. I was hoping for some tips as well on naming things. I tend to name things with the broadest noun, like rock, river, until I get something better. And usually it comes to me like months later. But I think to go back to what you were saying, Toy, the puns are great for funny games, for humorous games or games that have satire. But they But conversely, if the tone or thematics are serious, then it's terrible because it breaks immersion completely. So I think, and sometimes you can accidentally have a name like that, especially when you're naming geographic and geologic features, things. Sometimes you have accidental, terrible names.
Yeah, I was going to also say that giving people proper nouns for names is always interesting because it's a shortcut to the associations that people have in their minds with that particular noun. You know, calling somebody Joe Detroit gives a very different flavor to calling them Joe Smith, you know, or Joe Boomerang. They all bring different ideas of a character to mind. The tip I will give people is, and this is a really old one that I try to apply across the board, novels, films, everything. Try to avoid giving two characters the same initial letter, or at least the same first syllable if you can, because then it makes it easier to differentiate those characters in the player's mind or the audience's mind. So if your main character is called Samantha, don't have a character also called Stephen if you can avoid it. Because it can just get confusing. It's not always possible. Sometimes designers have final say over these things rather than writers, as I'm sure we all know. One game I worked on had 4 characters whose names all began with M, which was fun. I managed to get it down to 2 by the end of it, but I simply could not shake them on the remaining 2.
That's excellent. So my best friend at secondary school was called Sarah, and by the end of the 5 years of being there, we just learned to answer to each other's names because even in real life that happens. So this is a probably impossible question to answer, but how do you know when you've got it right? Like, what is there a point when you're world building that you sit and you look at that page and you think, excellent, I've done it. This is going to be perfect. Like, is Yanni shaking her head? Nope.
Do you want the cynical answer or the realistic answer?
Go for both.
Actually, they're the same. So when you've got it right, when it feels like it's almost perfect, it's been shipped, and there's one thing you really wish you could change. That is a way of life for every writer. I don't think we ever really feel like we've gotten it 100% right. So if you feel like it's almost there and you've gotten a lot of what you wanted, especially when you're working with a team and you don't have final say, I think you can feel pretty good about that.
Yeah, I think you're never really done, because just in the same way that you don't know every single thing about the world that we live in, and you never will as long as you live, as much as you read, as much as you talk to people, as much as you travel the earth, you will not know everything. And if you're making a complex world that has not only like realistic science and features, and you're making cultures, and you're making personalities, and you're possibly making like determinations about biology, and if it's rich, it will always keep giving, and there's always more to discover. And that's one of the things that's fantastic, but also frustrating, because it's also true that, yeah, it's about to ship and you're like, oh, that doesn't quite make sense according to the rules I made elsewhere. And then it's too late to fix. But yeah, that's like the worlds that we create, like ideally, and on some level, even if you don't explore it, and you don't need to explore all of it or document all of it, but in some way there should be a richness that is akin to real life.
And Steve?
I'm just unmuting myself. I'm going to turn this around into a question that's a little easier to answer, I think, which is, how do you know when you're ready to begin, when you've built the world and now you're ready to actually begin building the thing? Because that's something that I face a lot writing fiction. How do you know when you've done enough research? How do you know when you're ready to actually start drafting the story? And I think in the case of building a world, especially for games, it is largely feel and experience, unfortunately. But I think one way to know is to look at what you've got, and if you can already imagine lots of different interesting stories and scenarios that could take place in this world that you've built, If what you've built makes you think, oh, okay, so we could do this, or we could do that, or we could do this or that. If you're at that stage, then I think, you know, you're probably ready. And if not, then you've messed up somewhere. And if you can't do that, then you need to either build more, or you need to ease narrative restrictions that you may have placed upon the world. You may actually have put in too much detail, which can choke up your options.
Cool, thank you. I'm going to move on to an interesting question I saw pop up on the Q&A. So what elements of world building are more emphasized in games as opposed to different mediums like film, like comic books, like novels? We've obviously got a range of different backgrounds among the panelists, so I'm hoping that you can all give some interesting insight into this. So yeah, so what elements are more important in games? I can see Beth waving madly in the background, so I'm going to hand over to you.
I always go to Brenda Romero's quote on "the mechanic is the message." And for me, this is why I dip between being a designer and a writer. And usually what happens is I get to be a designer on my own games, and then for commercial games or for other independent games, and I'm sort of like given a writer role, right? When I'm really like, wait, design, because for me it goes hand in hand. So the mechanics are what's different. So the forms of interaction and actions that can be taken in a game, and then that connects to the rules that inform the world. So this is really essential in the kind of work that I'm doing, and I'm always looking for, I work specifically in Indigenous games, and so I'm looking for what are like Indigenous cultural practices and teachings that can be reinforced not just through story, but also through the forms of interaction themselves. And that helps inform what the story entails. So in one game that I worked on titled When Rivers Were Trails, there's actually a hidden honor system. And it's not forward facing on the user interface, but it's all interwoven with all of the choices that you make during sort of these like multiple choice narrative interactions. And it depends, you know, what your answers are will lead to different levels of honor, and that will actually change the version of the story, the version of history you were told throughout gameplay. So for me, it's really essential to look at games as a place of autonomy and self-determination for the player within the constraints and setting of this world that you've created.
That's great, thank you. Toya.
Yeah, I want to piggyback off of what Beth said and something that Annie said earlier about the emotional experience. And that I think sometimes when we think about mechanics, we get away from the fact that mechanics are themselves metaphors, and that players have emotional connections with them. For example, you've in this really difficult boss fight, and you're very low on health, and you're going to die with the next hit. And so you're racing around, try to stay alive, and you finally find a health potion. And you take that health potion. What do you feel? You feel relief. So a health potion is not just a health potion. It's a symbol of relief. It's restoration. So what do the mechanics say about like the psychological conditions that we're in when we're in a game? What do they represent emotionally to us? And I think that also ties into the world and like the circumstances in the world. You know, what do the circumstances say to us emotionally? How do they make us feel psychologically?
Annie?
Yeah, those are fantastic answers, y'all. That's definitely true. I think going back to what Beth was saying, that's like the mechanic is the message. And I think sometimes games have mechanics that contradict some of the thematics or the messaging. Like, just to make a very crude example, if you had a game that you wanted to be about love and community and nonviolence, and you had like the primary mechanic was shooting, that's obviously a contradiction. So I think you need to look at the mechanics and see back to like what is the player feeling, and how are my mechanics that I've chosen reinforcing that, or how can I make a world that helps reinforce those mechanics, and because it all works together to form emotion. But I was going to go back to the the question and say that in terms of one thing you said was, what's the difference between a game world and like something like film or comics? And for me, it's like, you know, in film and in comics, you can control what's in the frame. And in a game, you can't necessarily control that unless you're doing something like a platform or something with a very like something that's on a rail or something. But if you're doing an open world game, you can go anywhere, you can see anything, and you can see more, even if it is something like Last of Us, or a Naughty Dog game. You can walk around, you can look at stuff, you can pick things up sometimes, but you have this experience that's 360 often in a 3D game. So, and that's a critical difference, because you have to fill up that world and that screen with the other things that maybe you could crop out in other mediums. And so that means you have to sometimes be a little bit more holistic and think about entire environments, or like, you know, that filling the screen becomes a much bigger task.
That's great, thank you. So I'm going to shift to a quite a popular question, which is around existing IPs. So obviously, you know, it's one thing to come into a brand new idea, brand new world, and start creating that from scratch. But how do you world build within an existing IP? Like, what are the kind of challenges that you face? What are the kind of things that you'll be doing differently, maybe, you know, for a game series that already exists compared to something that's brand new? Anthony?
I'll start us off on this one. I think, and this ties back to really sort of what I said originally about creating a world to start with. You look for the undiscovered countries, as it were, within the established IP that, you know, that you're brought in to work on. You look for the gaps and the blanks and the bits that haven't yet been written, and where possible, dive into them. Because by definition, the other stuff's been done. You don't need to do it. I mean, whenever I look at shared world fiction, for example, and this includes things like when I did some brief work in superhero comics, you know, which are obviously very long established, rich, decades old universes. Look for the parts where nobody has touched yet, you know, where nobody's been yet. You know, if it's, I was once hired to write a novel for a fantasy shared world, and I just looked at the map and I found the furthest out little island that I could, that was barely even mentioned in the sort of world book. And I was like, that one, I'll take that one, because then I can do whatever I like, because nobody else has done it yet. You can do, if you know the existing lore, you can do a surprising amount of weaving, you know, taking your idea for a narrative element and then tying it into the existing stuff, as long as you're willing to do the work and be bold and, you know, sort of go and try and do the things, as I say, that haven't been done before. That's always my advice.
Great, thank you. Annie?
I've mostly done this work on existing IPs, and it is surprisingly creative. It's not as limiting as you might initially think. It's because most IP holders want you to expand the world, and they want you to tell stories. They've created rich worlds that many stories can be told in, and your job is not to replicate what has already happened in that world or in those stories. It is to expand and create and make the universe feel bigger and realer and more coherent than it otherwise does. And that can be really exciting, that limitation. One thing you do have to be careful of is honoring the IP, honoring the tone. Again, I keep bringing tone back because I think it's actually a critical thing. I think it's really important, because you can spend a lot of money on something that's the wrong tone. So you need to honor the tone of the original IP. You need to honor the kinds of things, not only the rules of the universe, you know, like the rules of physics or the rules of character, the rules of biology, but also but the ethical rules, as it were, and the tonal rules. So something that might work, some great idea that you have that might not work in the IP that you have, you can take it away and use it in something else. Like, there are sometimes, you know, some IPs are very dark, and some IPs are very funny, and some IPs are very sort of, they might not be dark, but they're light, and really terrible things don't happen in them. And so you have to make sure that you're honoring what's come before you, not only in terms of the world itself, but in terms of the, again, the ethics and the tone, the morality.
Thank you. Yeah. Toya?
But this is just a really practical note, because you are going to be working with IP holders. It's very important to stay in communication with those IP holders, because as both Annie and Anthony were saying, you don't want to do anything that is against the tone, or, you know, if you are adding to the world, you want to make sure that you have the IP holders' blessing. And you have some IP holders that you probably would like to give them some more flexibility because they're always breathing down your neck. And then you might have some IP holders that you never hear from. And so you would like some guidance, because you don't want to go too far afield of the IP or end up doing something that they will disagree with. So very early on, make sure that you and your team establish great communication and trust between you and the IP holder.
That's really great advice, definitely. I think one, like, that idea of honouring the original IP is so important. And I know that when I've done this before as well, I've spent a lot of time within the community of people that have played and loved that game for years and years. So especially if it's something where, you know, maybe I've been on the fringe or I'm not that familiar with, like really spending time and listening to what people are saying, listening and reading about what people love about these games, so that you can try and capture that and carry that through and kind of be faithful to that, I think is really important as well.
I'm just going to follow up and say, like what Toya, sorry, I've done this a lot. I work for an existing IP, so it gets me excited. What Toya was saying, that the relationship is extremely important. If you have a good relationship and you show the IP holder that you understand their IP that they've lovingly created for however long, they will give you much more creative freedom. They will trust you. Like if you can build trust in the beginning, you actually have so much more creative freedom. But if the trust breaks down and they think, I don't know if you really understand my IP, they will dictate what happens, and you will not be able to make the kinds of creative choices that you would otherwise have. So that's critical.
That's really good advice. Brilliant. Thank you. I'm going to ask a question now that I'm going to preemptively kind of line Beth up to answer, because she was quite excited about this earlier on. So one of the questions we had was, how do you approach world building when brought in to do a wallpaper job? So you know, you go into a team who have already they've gone running on ahead, very excited about their gameplay and their mechanics and maybe some of the characters, but they haven't done that foundational world building, and then you as a narrative designer are brought in to kind of fix this, make it look pretty. Beth, I feel like, sorry for calling on you like this, but I'd love you to get us kicked off on this and what your thoughts are.
Well, it's a good opportunity to really just bring up the idea of bringing in cultural consultants and people of diversity to be involved in their own representations. In the case of the work that I do, I know that Anthony has experience on a different kind of note. What usually happens with me, because I am Anishinaabe and Métis, is that I will be brought in to a game to help handle telling the native part of the story when the art has already been made, the characters have usually been named, or there's some kind of arc that's already been established. Certainly the world has been coming together, and that just cannot be done. And so that's like worst case scenario to be brought in for a wallpaper job, because really what needs to be happening from the beginning is reciprocity with any kind of form of diverse representations. And where I try to push companies is that means capacity building. So there are a lot of writers from diverse communities. They may not have experience in games, but they may be interested in being brought over into games. There are elders, and there are language speakers, and there are a number of people who are experts in their knowledge. And if they were viewed that way and brought in with the idea that, yes, it will slow down production time, and I think that's part of the hesitance to do that, but it will make the game so much deeper and so much more meaningful and really stand out. There's a uniqueness that can happen when things that have never been done before in games can happen just by taking the opportunity to listen. And so for the work that I do, the hope is that it doesn't go that way, because every time it has gone that way, it's a really difficult process, especially since once art has been made, there's a lot of hesitance to effectively lose the money that has been put into that, right? And into any kind of form of design. So really, hopefully, wallpapering won't happen. And if you are brought in to do something like that, that there's some sense of ability to be flexible, but ideally it just doesn't happen at all. And you're brought in from the beginning and writers are all treated equally, and it's a beautiful, amazing alternate world.
That sounds lovely. Toya, yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted a slight swerve because Beth mentioned diversity consultants, and I'm very passionate about it and trying to get more people to understand that it's a thing and it's a very important thing. If I can just say that, because Beth said, you can bring in people who don't necessarily work in games. Also, if you are from a marginalized group and you are looking to get into games, it is a great way to get started. And what's important to remember is that you're not just reviewing or critiquing something. You are also bringing in cultural and historical context, because it's very important for developers to understand the tropes and the stereotypes that they may be playing with that they are not even aware of. So if you have backgrounds in like queer theory or minority literatures, you know, if you've studied different philosophies or sociology, you can bring in that background knowledge that you already have to help inform developers of where they might be misstepping, or also where they're right. Because when we talk about critiquing, we focus on the negative, but I think it's also extremely important to let them know this is right. You know, this feels very realistic, so that, you know, developers don't make the same mistakes in the same project or a different project, or that they have tools that you've given them that they can use again.
That's brilliant. Thank you. Anthony.
Just to kind of follow up on that, actually, and that's a really focusing on the positive as well as critiquing the negative is a part of it, because the other thing, having been, you know, someone who's sort of been on the other side of that, is to make sure you let the people know, let the developers know that you are there to help them make it better. You know, you're not there to tear things down or whatever. You know, if you're brought in as that kind of role, go in with the attitude of, look, I'm here to help you make this better, and then everybody's happy. And the same thing really applies, even aside from the diversity or sensitivity issue. The same thing applies just as a writer being brought in for a so-called wallpaper job. You know, this is what I think we all know Rihanna Pratchett used to call it being a narrative paramedic, when you're kind of like parachuted in to a game that's nearly finished and told to just sort of add some story, which, and we all know that's never an ideal solution, but it does happen less now than it used to, which is a good thing. And when you go in, you have to go in with the idea that, okay, I am going to make this better. I'm going to work with them and make the decisions I can make, but let go of the things that are already decided and that simply can't be changed. So, I mean, you know, let's talk about wallpaper. Maybe the wallpaper has to be blue. That's decided. As Beth was saying, like, you know, art's already been done. Decisions, wallpaper blue. But it have to be plain blue, or could it have a really intricate pattern? Maybe some other colors like hinted at here and there. You know, it's not a perfect metaphor, I know, but you get where I'm going. You just, again, look for the places where you can make a difference, where you can have an influence. And again, don't be gratuitous, but if they will make it better, if they will make the game world richer, if they will make the game more interesting and fun to play, you know, attack those areas and go in with that attitude.
That's great, thank you. So I'd actually like to kind of jump from a lot of what we were talking about here around cultural consultancy and things like that, because a lot of the questions we are getting are around cultural appropriation. And, you know, we've talked about looking at all these different things for inspiration for building worlds. And then how do we as designers, you know, when we're using kind of real world cultures as inspiration, even if we're not consciously doing it, you know, at what point do we think that crosses into appropriation? And how can we as creators be sensitive about that? You know, how do you ride the line, I suppose, between one person really well here, how do you ride the line between cultural influence and cultural appropriation when you're world building? Anyone brave enough to kick that off?
I'm always the one that has the answer that no one, like companies tend not to want to hear if their budget is not already prepared for it, which is, again, to involve people from that culture in their own representations. And again, you know, as we've touched on in other commentary here, not just from the angle of because they have to, but because it will make the game better and it will give all of these other opportunities for expression. So I'm always the one that's like, pay more people and, you know, bring in the language speakers. And there are more and more companies doing this. And so it's been proven that it can be done. You know, voiceover actors as, you know, being the cultural representation isn't enough. You know, there can be writers, there can be people who are knowledge carriers from their community, fluent language speakers, people coming in from the music side. You know, there are a lot of opportunities. And so I think that the best way to avoid cultural appropriation is to actually involve people in equally paid roles that help them build capacity to go on to continue to work in games and game industry.
Toya?
I think having the phrase "nothing about us without us" is important to have in your head at all times. So at the very start, if you know that you are going to have certain cultures in the game, as Beth was saying, you should be allowing for that. You should be budgeting for that. I think also that the cultural appropriation line can be kind of a thin one, but are you telling somebody else's story? I think is a good thing to keep in mind. And also, do you yourself feel uncomfortable, right? If you are feeling uncomfortable, then it might be an intuitive check. And it can be difficult because you may not have any say-so in what the story is. But if you are having that check, then you need to let the creative director or the producer know, and then figure out, okay, why might we be going in the wrong direction? Do we need to bring in a diversity consultant? Do we need to change this altogether? Because, you know, cultural representation is extremely important. We want more of it. I think, you know, a lot of people want more of it, not just people from marginalized communities, but we have to do it respectfully. And I say that also as a marginalized person who writes about, you know, people who are not from my community. So marginalized people have to weigh that too. So, you know, if there's a check, figure out why you have that check. If you can from the very beginning, if you know where you're going, if you know what cultures you're including, make sure that you have those cultures included in the development process.
That's really great advice. Thank you. Annie?
I was just going to reiterate, you should find cultural consultants, even if you have a small game or a big game, find a way to include it in your budget and find a way to make it happen, because it's really critical. There's stuff you can do if you're from a majority culture. You can read, you can try and educate yourself as much as possible, but you should definitely find a way to hire and pay cultural consultants.
Anthony?
So I'm not the guy to, you know, obviously to look at me, you know, to talk about sort of minority representation and stuff. But what I will say, especially if there are directors, producers, and what have you out there watching, everybody's emphasized the importance of hiring people that you can talk to about this stuff. It's not expensive. It's really not. As a proportion of even a low budget games, it is a proportion of your development budget. We are talking a very, very, very small amount, and yet the returns you will get from it in goodwill, in the quality of the game, in all areas, frankly, and goodwill amongst the game development team as well, is almost immeasurable. So, when you hear people say, oh, hire these people, pay these people, don't shy away from it, because it really isn't expensive, and it's absolutely worth doing.
That's great, thank you. I think everyone's pretty much aligned on this idea, right? Like, the more we've got nothing to lose. Oh, sorry, Toya. Yeah.
I just want to add one caveat, and this comes from Tanya DePass of I Need Diverse Games, and she's also done a lot of diversity consulting. Don't bring in diversity consultants just to be able to say, well, we brought them in, and then you don't implement anything from what they told you to do. Hopefully, if you are spending the money on bringing them in, you are thoughtfully considering what they're saying. You're not just using them as a shield. So that's extremely important.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. Thank you. I think, like get the right people in to be talking about this kind of stuff, and build more diverse teams, like build them from the bottom up. Like, getting in consultants is a great start, but really, like, embed these people on your teams. Like, we don't just want teams of the same people. I can see Annie waving at me. Yeah.
I was going to say kind of what you're saying, which is that one way to get diversity in your game is to make sure that the culture that you have to make the game is a diverse one and is honoring diversity. Like, you're not going to make a game that honors diversity in any way if you have a culture that is replicating the structures that have oppressed people. You just need to look at your internal culture and really think about how to make that a diverse one and an ethical one and a fair one that's not replicating all of these structures.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. Thank you. So I'm going to pivot us completely onto looking at kind of tools and techniques, I suppose. So we've had quite a few questions around, obviously we've got some tips on how you start world building and how you start thinking about it, and the kind of people you want to get involved. But how do you start kind of writing and storing this information? We obviously, most people here know about the idea of a story Bible or a lore Bible, where you might kind of keep all of this in one place. But do any of you have any favorite tools you like using? Do you use Google Docs? Do you use Confluence? Do you use some magical software that we all should know about and start building in right now? What kind of stories do you have that you can share around? Oh, and perfect poll timing there. What kind of stories do you have around how do you capture this information and how do you share it, obviously, with the wider team? Toya?
I'm also an audiovisual person, but I'm also an extremely tactile person. And so when I'm getting started, I really need to feel what I'm working on. So I have a notebook. I need to feel the paper. I need to feel my pen, the pressure of my pen against the paper as I'm writing. And a lot of times I'll take little notes, and again, I'll ask those questions. But then I will convert them usually to a Word document or Google Docs. Depending on the team, they might use spreadsheets. So I've used spreadsheets as well. For my own projects, I like using a platform called Freedcamp. If you're familiar with Basecamp, it's very similar, but it's a platform that has, like, if you start a project, you have your to-do list there, you have your tasks there, you can add wikis, you have discussion fora. So everything is in one place, and everybody can see what they need. They can see what they need to work on. If there are comments, you can tag people into them so they can very quickly get the information they need. And I'll also quickly mention something about writing documentation, because there's an art to that as well. And I've learned, over these years that a lot of developers don't like to read, and that's not a slam against them, that's just true. And, sometimes I might get like a really long, lengthy email and I'm not particularly interested in reading it. So you want to write your documentation in a way that invites everybody on the team to collaborate, because world building is not just writing, it's not just narrative design, it's also sound, it's animation, it's the mechanics, as we've been talking about. So you want to write your documentation in a way that invites people to be inspired. So for example, if you have a bio, character bio, put all the visual stuff up at the top. Don't start with like the lengthy history of the character, because the artists and the animators and the sound designers can't find the information they need. Put that info at the beginning, and if they want to read the other stuff, they can. And so when you're writing, keep the tenets of good technical writing in mind. You know, bullet points, you know, white space, short paragraphs, so that you can easily draw the eye to the information that people need.
That's great advice, thank you. Was that software you mentioned, FreeCamp? Sorry, you're on mute.
It's Freed Camp.
Freed Camp.
Yeah.
Cool, thank you. I will be checking that out this weekend. Anyone else have any thoughts they'd like to share on how they collate their information? Oh, I think Anthony's hand shot up first. Annie, go for it.
I was just going to say, we use Confluence because we're AAA, but we can afford Confluence. But if it's just you, there's a platform called Scrivener, which I think is fantastic, which has screenwriting and also fiction writing, but also it has a great corkboard feature, and it has a sort of a scrapbook feature where you can add in all sorts of links and pictures and stuff. So I think I use it for my own fiction projects. I think it's fantastic, and it's quite cheap.
Anthony, did Annie steal your
Pretty much, yeah. I use a combination of, I have a notebook like Toya, which I carry with me everywhere, and I make all my initial notes longhand. Partly because, and that's not just me being it's not just an affectation. There have been studies about how we process information and retain information when we write it down, you know, longhand rather than typing it. We humans remember what we've written better than what we type. So that, you know, but also I just like it because you can draw lines and arrows and block things off and scribble things out. It's much more free form for brainstorming. But then, yes, I also use Scrivener. I've been using Scrivener since it launched. The graphic novel template within Scrivener is mine. I worked with the developer to put it in there. I use it literally for everything. Everything I write is in Scrivener because it has that massive flexibility that Annie mentioned. I use it for all my projects, novels, screenplays, games, absolutely everything, essays, you name it. And yeah, it's like $50 or something for a one-person license, so you can put it on multiple computers as long as they're all yours. It's an absolute steal.
So I actually bought Scrivener this week and have used it for 2 whole days, and I love it already. So yeah, I'm completely on board. Beth, how about you?
I'm just going to mention one that hasn't been mentioned yet. Typically, it'll be Confluence or Google Docs, depending on the scale of the game or company that I'm working with. But I've also become really fond of Lucidchart because it gives you that same ability to do like the bubbles and lines and all those kinds of aspects. Because for me, I have a difficulty with the linearity of documents because, you know, it sort of then starts to become this hierarchy or can feel like categorizing. And so I really like the ability to have those lines that you can draw and, you know, pull different features and move them around. And so that movement is really important. So Lucidchart is one that's another great option as well.
That's great, thank you. It's really interesting to hear how obviously, like, yeah, I've mainly used Confluence in the past working with studios, but it's interesting to hear how everyone has, you know, a slightly different way of doing it. Like some people really like that tactility, is that a word, of the writing down and the, you know, and having note cards or having paper, and other people, you know, have that they like the visuals, they like to maybe move bubbles around and link things up that way. Yeah.
it just occurred to me, like, if I handwrite, which is hard for me to do because I'm more like cyborg-like, I'm like connected with my laptop at all times, and it's really hard to disconnect me. But I handwrite when I need to because it also relieves anxiety. So if you are stuck on ideas or you feel like something isn't complete or you can't stop thinking about something, which is usually my problem, then handwriting also is a way to feel that it's come to some sense of completion, and it triggers in your brain this idea that you will remember and it will cement itself. And so that's a strategy that I use if you're someone like me who will get really caught up in those kinds of details and feel like, you know, if something isn't complete, you get this sort of sense of anxiety that it isn't complete. And when I was first starting out, that wasn't a problem because I could just do little indie games real quick and it was all good. But the longer that I've been in this as a career, and you've got 3 to 5 year development cycles, I mean, it's not over when you go to sleep. So it really works as a strategy for me.
That's awesome, thank you. And I feel like this is kind of leading us into something we haven't touched on yet, which is obviously as game writers and narrative designers, you know, we're much less likely to be working in isolation than probably almost any other kind of writer. And you know, we've had some questions around measuring quality of your own work before you're maybe sharing it and presenting it. And I think that raises a really important question of, you know, at what point do you start to collaborate when, you know, as a narrative designer who is world building for a team, at what point and to what extent do you start to talk to other teams, other departments, bring other people in and share the ideas? Because I imagine that, you know, there's a balance between not wanting to share too early and having things kind of derail, but also obviously not wanting to share too late and effectively waste time and therefore money and budget, maybe going down a path that, you know, doesn't suit the game direction, doesn't suit the art style, whatever. Does anyone have any thoughts on that idea of you know, collaborating and bringing other people in? Silence. Does this mean that nobody wants to collaborate and you're all just there like, nope, I just write everything myself? Annie.
I was trying to let somebody else go first, but I think you should collaborate as early as possible with as many people as possible, because you get so many more ideas if you collaborate with people. Like some of my favorite parts of working on games have been working with the artists and just brainstorming and spinning up ideas, and people from all different disciplines bring new perspectives that you don't have. That's why you want not only a diverse team, and like you want a diverse team in all ways, because it brings lots of different ideas to the table, brings new stuff to the table. But I think you have to also know, be very clear on who makes the decisions. Like that's like collaborate often, collaborate early, be clear on who makes the decisions, because that's when things get kind of mucky, is when is it just a like everybody gets to discuss it and you make a collaborative decision, or is it like everybody shoots out their ideas and then one person, it's their job to make the decision? I think that's been a good way for me to collaborate in the past and avoid, you know, just the discomfort of people feeling like, I don't know where my idea is going.
That's great, thank you. Any other thoughts on this? Toya? Oh, yeah,
So
Toya first.
I can answer this from the opposite end of the spectrum, which was why I was quiet at the beginning, because I have mostly worked with small indie teams or with first-time developers. For one reason or another, they wanted to work with a game. But I'm also going to echo what Annie said. When I am working with a client, I am a freelancer, I always take a period of time, it's usually 2 weeks, where we brainstorm together. So if it's just the client and just me at first, then we talk, or if it's the entire team, we do a lot of brainstorming to decide what the scenario is, what the story scenario is, what the world is. I write up kind of a prospective doc where I put ideas together. I include references. I put art references in there. I might have some video, that sort of thing. We've been talking a lot about how our brains work, so that's also very important, keeping in mind that, you know, everybody has different learning styles. Our imaginations work in different ways. you want to present, people can use, whether it's audiovisual, whether it's text, math, whatever people need. But it's extremely important, as Amy was saying, to get everybody on the same page. And so if you're working with a small team or you're working specifically with a client, make sure that everybody understands where you're going, and everybody agrees to it. Because again, there are clients, I've mentioned people who are hands off. They just expect you to go off, write something, bring it back to them, and it's going to be exactly what they want. And that's not necessarily the case. You want them to know also that they have responsibility in the project.
That's great, thank you. Beth, did you have something you'd like to chip in?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I think like Toya, I've worked a lot with, indie companies or, just early on developers, and I just have a very wide range of experiences, everything from it's my responsibility to just write one scenario in an already existing game, which the design is already set for, and, I'm providing a component, right, within this much larger system, to I'm managing a team of over 30 Indigenous writers. Also, Toya was involved in that game as well, which was really important to have like Indigenous and Black intersectionality with that particular game. And so that was a lot of writers to manage. And so instead of getting everyone together on one meeting call somehow, some way, I was the go-to on that. And so it had to be this sort of form of like, everyone is just going to have to trust that they're self-determined in the work that they're doing. And everyone was then given the task to focus on their own particular stories and really given self-determination in what places on the map that was to take place on, and what characters and from what community within the context of the game that was already established. So that's what I find with collaboration is ideally that collaboration will really be, I really enjoy working with artists, with level designers, because at the end of the day, like who's going to be implementing? The level designers. And so it's really good to work very closely with them rather than being disconnected, because there are ways in which maybe they'll interpret what you've written differently, or maybe there are constraints within the game and the assets that you weren't necessarily fully aware of, right? If you're not all on the same page and fully involved. And so there are all of these different possible models. So collaborate early and collaborate often, but also within understanding that, in some instances, maybe you're a communication pathway for a wider team. And that's going to just have to be something you'll have to work out structurally.
That's great, thank you. Anything to add, Anthony, or are you pretty happy that we've covered?
I think just about everything's been covered. Communication really is key. Yeah, there are a few things worse, because my career has been entirely freelance. I've never staffed in a studio. I've always been a freelance contractor. But that ranges from AAA to indie. And so, yeah, like Beth, I've got a massive range of experiences. Good communication is always the key. There is little more disheartening to a writer than being given a brief, told to go away and write something. You do that, you come back, and then told that actually they can't implement what you wrote because of some technical limitation of which you weren't informed. And obviously in games, that's technical limitations like that are something that are fairly unique to this medium. And so it's, maybe it behooves you as a writer to ask, if you're not being offered the information, and say, what are the technical limitations here? How many people can talk at once? That's a really simple thing that so many developers don't think to tell you about. Like, how many characters can speak can move at the same time in a cutscene, things like that. So yeah, communicate.
Yeah, and I mean, from my point of view as well, communication is absolutely the most important thing. And I'd also add it is surprisingly easy to go off down a path very fast without really realizing that maybe you haven't checked in with the right people, and to come up with an idea like it I think looking from the outside in, it can sound like it's just, well, obviously, I'd be checking every day, but sometimes every day isn't enough. You know, you need to be checking in on the hour. If you're making really rapid decisions and you're working maybe with level designers to really get stuff out, that constant communication it's more than just a daily check-in. You know, it is just kind of an open, ongoing conversation with the people that you need to be talking to, because I've definitely done that before, where I've got to the end of the day, felt really proud of the work I've done, and then finally checked in with the director, who's gone, no, like, no, go back and do that again. It's like, oh, great. So yeah, save yourself the trouble. So I'd like to talk about characters and character design and world building, because that's something that's come up in a few questions. So one really good one that came through is, how would you use characters' descriptions, names, looks, and traits to contribute to world building? So changing the subject again very quickly. Anthony, go for it.
Go on, I'll start. I think it all comes, it's all part and parcel. Like, it has to feel like it fits within the world. There's not one sort of set answer, other than to say, if you know what your world is, then things like names and clothes and those elements will feel right within the world. And if they don't, then either you need to do more work on the world itself, or you need to change those elements of the characters. And sometimes one will come out of the other. Sometimes you may not be sure about something in the world, but you'll have a really great character design and you look at it and go, that's brilliant. Now, what does that mean about the world? If this is how people dress, what does that mean about the world? And that might actually lead you to a really good, positive world building place where you're building the world around this concept of a character visual or something. It really can work in just about any way you like, as long as you remain open. The most important thing in world building of all kinds, and I think we've all said this in one way or another this evening, is just remain open to ideas, to experimentation, to collaboration, to other people's ideas. You know, fight for your ideas, sure, but be aware that your ideas may not always be the best. You know, be willing to say, yeah, actually, that's a better idea. Let's do it that way. Just remain open to all of that. And, you know, and keep, that's what keeps the creative juices flowing. Take inspiration from everywhere and in every direction.
Toya?
I think this is where analogs can help, because Anthony worked something when he was talking about the clothes that a character might be wearing, and it might not necessarily be just that their clothes look really, really cool. Clothes also are functional, and throughout history, clothes have had certain functions and in their design. So for example, if a character has pockets, you know, on a vest, you know, why are the pockets there as opposed to being, say, in the pants? So you might do some research, you know, for times when pockets were in vests. And it might tell you something about like the work in that world, or, you know, it might be something as cheesy as, you know, people placed things that were very important to them right next to their heart. So that's like a little bit of flavor that you can add to the world. So look at your environments, look at your characters, and the environments that they're in, and see if you can do some research of things that are analogous, not just, again, realistic, but also fictional. Are there some fictional parallels that you can look at?
Annie?
Yeah, I was going to say, I think you, like, clothes say a lot about people, and the look of your character says a lot about that, who that character is, but also about the world that you're in. Like, are you, for example, replicating Western society's ideas about sexuality and gender, for example? Like, do you want to do that? Do you want to have a culture where women's breasts are something that are like nipples are not shown, for example? Do you, like, is that taboo in your culture? Is that, because that's a Western thing in the last several hundred years? Do you want to make your character look like they're controlled? Like, do you want to, you know, as Toya said, like, what kind of tools do they have, if they have any, and what do they do? What do they mean about in the world? And what about the character? Like, is the character controlled? Is the character a craftsperson? Does everybody have tools in this world? You know, I think for example, like, and what does it say about who this person is in relationship to the rest of their society? Like, it's like a woman who, like 30 years ago, if you wore a red dress to a funeral, that was like, it's quite a statement, you know. And like, you also then, are you creating a world where it's actually like says something that you're wearing a red dress to a funeral, for example? But another thing is just to be careful that when you make those choices about your characters in relationship to what they mean in the world, to not replicate some of the terrible destructive tropes, like, for example, making all your villains scars or disfigured or something, that replicate ideas of appearance and value, like being the same thing.
That's great, thank you. And when it comes to, so we've talked about obviously kind of world building generically. So, you know, we've talked about how to get started and the kind of things to think about, and also building within certain IP. But I'm also interested when it comes to different genres of games. Like, obviously, you know, we have very clear kind of popular games and types of games that we know we're going to go in, like whether that's an FPS or whether that's a horror or whatever. But if you're going into a different genre of game, do you approach world building differently? You know, are there things that you'll think about differently depending on what type of game you're making, or is it safe to say it's kind of a foundational, you know, the same at the foundation level, and then you build up? Like, does anyone have any thoughts on that kind of thing? Beth, I can see you waving at me.
The reason I couldn't answer the last one is because I'm currently experiencing, you know, this like internal trauma of working on a procedural game, which I also say, you know, in another way is an amazing challenge that I love, which is that any of the main NPCs can be killed at any point. And this is for Weird West. They may come back as a zombie and try to kill the player instead of giving them that important plot point that you were really hoping they would get to explain where they needed to go for the rest of the journey. And so that has been a completely different experience. I am accustomed to having a lot more sort of, you know, either I'm working on art games where the player has complete self-determination and there's a lot of like the meaning is in the meaning you make and they can interpret it the way that they want, all the way to the other end, which is that there are specific characters that, you know, elders and language speakers and community members have been involved in the representations of, and, you know, it's very important to be historically accurate or at least very respectful, depending on, you know, if it's a historically accurate person who's being represented or maybe it's a fictional character, but all of that is really important. To jumping into a procedural game where, you know, somebody could die. And so you have to treat how you approach the writing in that much differently, which is that you have all of these crumbs all over, right? Like you can't just have one cookie and expect somebody's going to eat that one. This is a terrible metaphor, because who would want to eat crumbs and then say that they're filled up on one cookie? But I hope you understand what I'm getting at. You've got to put all of these little pieces everywhere, like it's this vast puzzle, so that if one of the pieces gets killed and comes back as a zombie to kill your player, they're still going to get what you need them to get in order for them to progress through the game.
That's a really great point. Like, that idea of building redundancy into your game world, I think is something, especially in like open world procedural games where literally anything can happen. It's a really important thing to be considering. So yeah, really great point. Does anyone else have any thoughts they'd like to share?
Maybe with a metaphor other than a cookie, though, or eating cookies off of the floor.
Yeah, don't try that at home. Anthony?
So I'll just, again, sort of slightly turning the question around into something that I can more easily answer, I think, is the, I don't think I've ever worked on a game where the game genre wasn't, the details and the specifics, sure, but in terms literally of the game genre, and for those watching who might not know, what we mean by that is things like an FPS or a platformer or a walking simulator, which has nothing to do with the story genre necessarily, the game mechanic genre. That's always been known on any game where I've come in at the stage that, you know, that a writer's been brought in. And the amount of world building and the type of world building that you do can vary massively between those different kinds of game. And while in an ideal world, every game would have a massively realized and detailed world that we've all spent years building, and it's all wonderful and beautiful and lovely, you know, realistically, that's not going to happen for your battle royale, light-hearted cartoon arcade shooter, you know, and that's okay, because those games don't need that sort of level of detail that something like, say, a Skyrim does. And so I think really it all depends on the genre, and it depends on what the game is about. Is the game about the story, about the lore, about the world? If it is, then yes, it needs to be detailed. Yes, you need to approach it in the ways that we've all been talking about this evening. If it's not, you know, I mean, I wrote the game CSR Racing, the drag racing game on the iPhone. And we did do a bit of world building for that. There is world building. There are backstories to the characters. Almost none of it is visible to the player, but we did what was necessary for us to be able to write those characters so that they were consistent, but no more. We did no more than that because there was no point. The player would never see it. It wasn't important to us. It didn't help development of the game. So we did what was necessary, but no more than that, because it would have been a waste. I would have liked to, of course I would, but they weren't going to pay me for it because it wasn't necessary. So, you know, you have to approach these things in a realistic manner and say, what do we need to know in terms of world building for this game? And if that's a fully realized world, wonderful. But if it's not, learn to live with it.
Toya?
Yeah, I just wanted to piggyback off of something Anthony said. And I call it like an iceberg concept. So there's what the player needs to know about the world, and there's what the team needs to know about the world. And what the player needs to know is very small in comparison to what everybody else needs to know. And so I'll give a slight example. Maybe in an RPG, you come upon a town and someone's playing a musical instrument. Well, in your world building information that you shared with the team, you may have talked about the wood of the instrument, you know, the number of strings, you know, the size and dimensions of the instrument, because all of that stuff is going to affect how this fantastical instrument sounds. The player doesn't need to understand all of that. They're hearing it. They might see the music play it, but they don't need to know all the technical aspects into, you know, the dimensions and the strings and the type of wood. And I think a lot of times when we're approaching world building, it can seem like such an overwhelming task because, oh my God, you're creating a world, you're creating a universe. But keep in perspective what the player needs to know, what you need to know. Don't develop things and design things you don't need. If the economy in the game isn't important, don't build out an economy. So stay to exactly what you need.
That's great. Thank you. Oh, yeah, Anthony?
Just to follow up and reiterate on that, yeah, I call it the 80-20 rule, which is a rule that you'll find in all walks of life, really. But speaking of CSR Racing, I had to convince that studio of this, the necessity of this when I was working on that game, which is that 80% of everything that goes into that background and the writing, the player will never see. But without it, the game won't feel right because you'll lack the knowledge to have that consistency. And so, yeah, as Toya said, if the economy isn't important, don't write about the economy. But if the economy is important, then you need to write it, you need to design it and build it, even if the player won't see the mechanics of it. If it's important to the game, the developers have to know it.
Brilliant, thank you. So obviously we talked a bit about what we as writers are kind of creating in the background, and then what the player's seeing at the end of the day. And obviously, you know, most games are very visual. Most games, you know, they're interacting with the environment and things like that. And you know, we might pick up on some of this narrative through the environmental narrative, through posters you see on the wall, through, you know, the infamous video game graffiti and things like that. So as writers, how much influence or how much involvement do you have with that environmental narrative design side of a video game? Tough question. Beth?
For the work that I do, it's really vital because Indigenous people are connected with the lands that they're on and with, and have been with for many generations. And so that's something that sometimes when I come on to a game, I have to explain that the plants, everything from the plants to the way that the water is and what types of bodies of water, are there rivers, are there lakes, how much water is there, all of that is going to then impact what kinds of structures are lived in and what tools there are, what's eaten, right? And really pulling it back to thinking about food sovereignty and the languages that are spoken, because for me as Anishinaabe, our language is known to come from the land, right? So it's something that comes from our science, from listening and from observations. And so science being so, very importantly connected, then it has to all have meaning and relationality. And even if it is a fictional world, I've done comics and alternate realities and in my own work, and I do a lot of work in what's referred to as Indigenous futurisms, which is past, present, and future is the hyper-present now. It's a form of science fiction. It still matters, right? Because it's actually about that relationship of relationality, regardless of what time period, whether it's time slippage or, something that's alternate. It all has to be connected. And I think that it's really phenomenally important for writers to be involved in that process.
Annie?
Yeah, I think it's critical for writers to be involved in that. And again, just to go back to something I said in the beginning, establishing the tone and making sure that people understand what the tone is, because in a large environment, you will have artists creating things in the environment. And if, say they're writing, say there's some kind of industrial location and you have people making posters, promotional posters for whatever the thing is. If the tone is wrong, it really jars the user out of the game. It jars the user out of the world. If you have things that are tonally off, or they're the currency thing is a good example. Maybe you don't need to design a currency, but is there a currency? Is there a currency at all? And if there is the currency bartering? Is it a gift economy? Is there money? Is there something else that's exchanged? Because those little things inform what the artists make, and they inform character design. They inform what's in the world, and all of those things. Again, you don't necessarily have to know all of it, but you have to have enough that you can say that you can help guide what is and isn't in the world.
Toya?
I'll go back to what I was saying earlier, that everybody is a storyteller, and it's incredibly important, especially as a narrative designer, to facilitate that experience, because you'll have artists and animators who don't think they're storytellers, and they can tell stories in phenomenal ways that you cannot. They can especially take an idea that you have and make it 10 times better, or turn it into something that's better than you were imagining. And especially with environmental storytelling or environmental narrative, in a lot of ways, and I've mentioned subtext, you can have subtextual clues about the world, about characters. If you think about a living space, what's in that living space, what is important to the character, what can you learn about that character in their living space? You can even foreshadow things that are going to be happening in the story. So it's very important to work closely, with artists and animators and also sound designers, to think of ways, I like to call them revelatory breadcrumbs, those little clues that give players insights. It doesn't mean that all players are looking for them, or that all players will find all of those little revelatory breadcrumbs, but they're there, they add richness and they add depth, and they also involve non-writers in a way that make them feel like they are important storytellers on the project.
Anthony?
So I know we're coming to the end here, and Andrew probably wants us to wrap up quickly, so I'll be brief. Just to say that Toya made a really good point there about the importance of bringing in artists, because people will read stuff into the objects and the world and the visuals, and that's because, and all writers must remember this, words, people, books, documents can all lie. And everybody knows that. They are inherently untrustworthy, and players in any game will never fully trust everything that they read or that somebody says to them, or, you know, anything at all that is words. But what they see in the world, the objects and the world itself, that they will believe 100%. And so the design of the objects, a poster, as Toya mentioned, things like that, those players will take as truth. They will say, yes, this is a thing that exists, it is real, it is true within the world. But the words they hear, the things they read, they will not necessarily. They might, but they will always have that niggle of doubt of like, this could be a lie. And especially in more game, you know, some game genres and types more than others. Now we can use that to our advantage as writers. Obviously, misdirection is a wonderful tool that we can all make great use of, but it's very important to bear that in mind when you are building the world, because again, yes, as everybody has said, the artwork, getting the other departments involved for that reason is so important, because they will present what a player perceives as the objective truth within a game, rather than the subjective truth, which is what the writer's job will be.
That's great, thank you. So I do actually have one last question that I'm hoping we can cover in like 20 seconds for each person. And I am putting you all on the spot here, so do forgive me. But if you could give our listeners one game for them to go and play, you know, this weekend, just to try out, that is an excellent example of world building, what would it be? You don't even have to say why, just give us some titles. And while you're thinking, I'll give mine. So mine would be, I'm going to recommend people to play Tacoma, which is a really short narrative-driven game, which has excellent environmental narrative and world building that I found really, really interesting. Does anyone else like to share? The panelists have had no prep for this question, by the way, so I am throwing them on the spot. Toya.
Undertale. I'll just say it uses lots of different things, from the art, environmental narrative, sound design, music themes, the text effects, sound effects for the characters. I don't think I've seen a better example of getting a character's personality through the way their text sounds. So Undertale.
Brilliant, thank you. Any other rapid fire suggestions?
So,
go on, Beth.
All right, I'll just quickly, I was going to say Tacoma as well. So you stole that
Sure.
one from me. But instead, I will actually say Gone Home, which is, of course, the previous game from Fulbright, which is, Gone Home is a tiny world, tiny, tiny little world and universe, but it is so well constructed and so fully realized. It makes a massively immersive game out of a tiny, tiny scenario. So absolutely do go and play that.
Great, thank you. Beth, and then Annie.
I go back to BioShock because of the way in which the world is so particularly created, but also how it can invoke empathy for players. Decisions really matter in that game and have a long-lasting impact on the ending there.
Yeah, brilliant example. Thank you. Annie.
Journey, This War of Mine, Whatever Happened to Edith Finch.
You're cheating, that's already too many. That's some great recommendations.
I will absolutely second Journey, though. That's a brilliant example because it has no words, no text, nothing but visuals, and yet it builds a complete world. Fantastic.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Now I'm going to hand over to Andy quickly before I get into trouble for overrunning. But thank you to all of our panelists. Thank you to all of the audience and the Q&As we've had. We could have gone on for hours talking about this stuff in the end, but I hope you found it useful. Andy, do you want to say your thing?
I will do. I am just in the middle of the joy that share screen does not allow you to come into the PowerPoint presentation. You've got to juggle around it. Hello, everybody. Before you disappear, we'll give out some contact details after I've given you the short blurb. So, as I said, it's a bit like the Marvel films. Stay with us for the goodies afterwards. So, I would like to say this is the 5th of the 5 panels. I can't believe we managed to get through this week so quickly. Thank you for coming along this evening. Thank you to those who come to several of the sessions. We are already plotting some more things in the near future. So please do stay tuned. One way to do that is, of course, to join the Writers Guild, where you can get information on this and all of the support, etc. I will ask you to, again, just to look at those surveys that will come through they're on your screen right now, and they will come through on your email. That will really help us to help you within the industry. I'd like to thank Fusebox for the sponsoring the event and for helping us get out to everybody out there. I'd like to thank everybody for sharing their lockdown locks with us. It's been great to see the state of video narrative hair during all of this current crisis. And I would also like you, without upsetting any of your neighbours, to bang on the floor, clap your hands, bang your pans to say thank you very much to the panelists this evening. I'll hand you back to them and ask, I'll start it off, if you would like to share your Twitter handles, because we get asked that each time. So you can find me, Andrew Walsh. You can find me at English Scribe. English Scribe was all one word. Why I chose that, I don't know, because it confuses everyone, but that's where I am. And I'll hand over to the other panelists to give you their contact details, should they wish, because obviously not everyone wishes to share everything on here, because they're not as crazy as we are over doing that. But yeah, you can contact me there. Who would like to go next? Anthony?
Sorry, I was expecting you to throw it back to Samantha. Yeah, sure. So I am on Twitter and all social media, in fact, with just my name, Anthony Johnston. I don't know if you can see it there, if you're watching this on the screen. Just spell it right. It's ANTONYJOHNSTON. If you spell it right, you will. That is my Twitter, that is my Facebook, my Instagram, it's my website, everything. So spell it right, you will find me.
Annie?
I'm on Twitter at Annie GRMBL, Annie Grumble. I think I was in a grumpy mood that day. I'm not sure, but I'm on Twitter.
Samantha?
So I am on Twitter. Mine's a confusing one because it's basically my name without any vowels except for one of them, and I can't remember which one it is. So I think the easiest way to find me is literally Andy will have tweeted me in the Writers Guild tweets for this panel. So I'm the one that looks closest to Samantha Webb on there. I think that's probably the easiest way.
Beth?
Yeah, probably similar for the spelling of the actual Twitter handle, or you can just search Beth LaPonce and you will find me. I make games and comics and stuff. You'll find me on there.
I will make sure I tweet these out as well. I will go and do that after this event. And Toya?
Yeah, so I'm Toya K. Finley. Make sure you spell Toya correctly, TOIYAKFINLEY. I do have to warn you that I don't tweet a whole lot of thoughts out. I tweet a lot of dog videos, so if you like dogs.
And that wasn't a desperate bid to get everyone to fill mine in so that you can come and get everybody else's. That was just what happened at that moment. So I will say again, thanks a lot for coming along. We'll let you know as and when recordings become available. We are working on that, on the technical elements of that, to put those out. Watch out for future events. And thank you again to you for coming along, and to all our amazing panelists. I know I've learned a lot tonight as well. Thank you very much. Cheers. Have a great one all.
I'd just like to add really quickly that I will tweet out everyone's answers to the what video game they recommend question, because I've seen a couple of people ask about that. So go onto Twitter and we'll share our environmental narrative world building games with you all.
Thank you very much, and
Thanks.
good evening.